While Destroy All Monsters was supposed to be the very last Godzilla movie ever made, Toho decided to continue the franchise with an animated series in 1969. They approached Filmation, an American animation studio that was most well known for The New Adventures of Superman, Fat Albert, and Star Trek the Animated Series. The intention behind this animated Godzilla series was to gear the franchise more towards kids. Ultimately, though, it fell through, and the project went unrealized. It wouldn't be until about 10 years after this when Godzilla would finally get an animated series, but this one was produced by the legendary American studio Hanna-Barbera, and we'll get there when we get there with that one. After the deal with Filmation dissolved, Toho decided to make a Godzilla movie geared towards children, with the goal being to make it as cheaply and as quickly as humanly possible. One way in which this would be achieved is through the use of stock footage from a bunch of previous Godzilla movies, like Ebirah Horror of the Deep and Son of Godzilla. New scenes were filmed with Ishiro Honda returning to direct. Haru Nakajima once again donned the Godzilla suit, while Minya was again portrayed by Little Man Machan. Like some of the previous installments in the series, Eiji Tsuburaya was credited as the special effects director, but this was more of a ceremonial title. In his final interview before his death in 1993, Ishiro Honda said the following to the fan site Toho Kingdom, quote, "I believe Tsuburaya was personally involved with editing and similar matters. The film may have been generally put together, but he definitely looked over the footage and instructed the staff to shorten certain scenes, etc." So he was still involved to some extent, but he was never actually on set during principal photography. Instead, Teruyoshi Nakano would step in to fill that duty. Nakano would go on to serve this role in every remaining Showa Godzilla movie, as well as The Return of Godzilla and even the North Korean kaiju film Pulgasari. If you want to know why he was involved, then go check out my video on the history of that movie if you're curious. For Godzilla's Revenge, though, filming started in October 1969, and the movie was released less than 2 months later. Yes, that is how quick the turnaround time was for this movie, and it definitely shows. Godzilla's Revenge, or as it's sometimes known, All Monsters Attack, is widely regarded by the vast majority of Godzilla fans to be the worst installment in the entire franchise. A lot of this has to do with the overabundance of stock footage, the kiddie tone, and the film feeling more like an anti-bullying PSA rather than an actual Godzilla movie. There are some defenders, by the way, don't want to disregard them. As a kid, I remember seeing the trailer for this as a bonus feature in the video game Godzilla Unleashed. They really did their best to make it seem like an action-packed spectacle, and eventually my mom reserved a DVD copy from the library for me to see. And this DVD was somewhere else in the state of Wisconsin at a different library, so I had to wait for it to arrive, and I'll never forget waiting weeks for it to come. The feeling of finally going to pick it up and being so excited to actually have the DVD in my hands is a feeling I'll never forget. However, I'll never forget the soul-crushing disappointment of realizing that this was not the Kaiju Royal Rumble that I thought it would be. As a result, I bitterly hated this movie. In fact, I think it was the first time I ever saw a movie and then went, wow, that sucked. Mind you, I was like 5 years old, and so for me, this was the first time actually being let down by a movie in my entire life. But over time, that hate has slowly faded from mere indifference to ironic enjoyment. So much so, I would go as far as to say that this is a guilty pleasure of mine. I know, crazy. But without further ado, this is, by far, the most hated Godzilla film ever made, Godzilla's Revenge. Really quick, this Kaiju retrospective video is sponsored by the channel membership. If you're looking to support the Firewood Media YouTube channel in any way, consider becoming a member to support the channel. It's kind of like Patreon, but it's for YouTube. You get to see all of our videos early before they come out and are released to the public. There's channel member updates, behind the scenes stuff, and the best part is it's only $1.99 a month. You don't have to if you don't want to, but it's an extra perk to help the channel and to make content just like this. Also, we have a merch store, so if you want to pick up a poster or a t-shirt from our Kaiju short film restricted zone, then you totally can. You can use code Kaiju at checkout for free shipping on your order. We've got hats, t-shirts, windbreakers, anything you could really want to help support the channel. The link is in the description for our merch. And with all that out of the way, I just wanted to say thank you for watching, and let's get right into it. Ichiro is a lonely latchkey kid who spends most of his time avoiding bullies and daydreaming about Monster Island, where Godzilla and other kaijus live. One day, after being pushed around by a gang led by a boy that he nicknames Gabara, Ichiro visits his friendly neighbor, Shinpei, a toy maker who encourages him to stand up for himself. But with his parents always busy working, Ichiro is left to his own devices, making dinner alone and escaping into his imagination. Using a toy radio, he pretends to contact Monster Island and dreams himself into a place where monsters battle it out in ways that mirror his own struggles. On the island, Ichiro meets Minya, Godzilla's son, who is also being bullied by a kaiju coincidentally named Gabara. Minya, like Ichiro, is scared to fight back, but Godzilla forces him to train and defend himself. Watching Minya learn to stand up for himself gives Ichiro a new perspective, but before he can apply it, reality takes a turn. He accidentally stumbles upon a pair of bank robbers hiding out in an abandoned factory. When they realize he might have seen too much, they kidnap him and tie him up. Rather than panicking, Ichiro draws on his Monster Island adventures. While pretending to be asleep, he imagines Minya finally defeating his bully through clever tactics rather than brute strength. Inspired, Ichiro pulls a similar trick on the robbers, managing to escape and delay them just long enough for the police to arrive and arrest them. The next day, with a newfound sense of confidence, Ichiro faces off against the real Gabara, refusing to back down. In a burst of mischief after the fact, he pulls a prank on a sign painter, accidentally getting him covered in paint before dashing off. This boldness wins him some respect, and for the first time, he heads to school without feeling like an outsider. Now, Godzilla's Revenge was directed by Ishiro Honda, who usually tries to include some type of overarching theme in all of his works. Even in films that are as ridiculous at times as King Kong vs. Godzilla, he still wanted to center the story around the general theme of TV in Japan being batshit insane. The mindset that any publicity is good publicity, no matter how much destruction is caused as a result of that mindset. Looking at Godzilla's Revenge, one might think that the general overarching theme of this film is don't be a bully. You know, don't bully people. Be a buddy, not a bully. That type of stereotypical shit. And while that very much is in the film as a central message, I do think that he's trying to say a little bit more than just that. I really want to highlight the world that Ichiro himself lives in. A good majority of the film was shot in Kawasaki, which at the time was very polluted and very run down, and it truly reflected just how bad post-war Japan really was, even in the late 60s. I think that the film does a really good job of showcasing the economic hardship that families were going through at the time, with Ichiro being a latchkey kid and both of his parents work. I mean, let's be fair. His surroundings in the real world throughout this film are not that glamorous, which is the point. There's a reason why he, a lower class kid, fantasizes about escaping to Monster Island to be with Godzilla. It's because his home life is garbage, and the place where he lives isn't the best. So it works as an escape for him. I find that to be a very interesting aspect of the film that I wish was explored more. At the end of the day, though, it's still a kid's movie that's trying to just entertain children and tell them, hey, don't bully people. But I really wish that it was just a little bit more mature and it explored these themes of poverty just a little bit better and in a less shallow way. Once the movie actually starts, you get the idea that the world of Godzilla's Revenge is bizarre, and not in a fun, surreal way. More in a, wait, how does any of this actually work kind of way. The biggest question is whether the Godzilla movies exist as movies in Godzilla's Revenge, or if the events in those films actually happened and are just a part of history. It's never made clear, and just when you think you might be able to piece it together, things get even murkier because the kaiju sequences all take place in Ichiro's dreams. So then you have to ask yourself, is he remembering these monster fights from movies that he's already seen, and that's why it's all stock footage, which would be kind of creative, Or the more likely answer are the filmmakers just being lazy and slapping together old scenes and calling it a dream sequence. If the prior movies did happen in universe canonically, like the events of, say, Invasion of Astro Monster actually happened, Ichiro wouldn't have any way of knowing the events of Son of Godzilla since they all took place on an isolated island, completely separate from civilization. So if he does know them, that implies that he actually saw them in a movie, which means the Godzilla films exist as films in this specific world. But then there's the line where he says that Minya's roar sounds like a car screeching, which raises even more questions. Minya's never been seen attacking a city, and most people in Japan probably wouldn't even know that Minya exists. So, how does Ichiro know him? If this is just from watching the movies, then the movies are movies in this universe. But if the monsters are real, then why does Ichiro idolize them instead of, fearing them for the unimaginable destruction that they've caused over the years? If kaiju have actually destroyed Japan before, public perception should be way more negative. Instead, Ichiro treats them like superheroes. It's a logistical nightmare, but at the end of the day, it's not even worth trying to make sense of it, because the movie itself doesn't care. The whole thing is framed around a child's dreams, so canon just disintegrates into nothingness. Some might see that as a flaw, and honestly, I'm on the fence. On one hand, it works as a straightforward kids movie, but on the other hand, it's so completely nonsensical that it kind of stops working even as that. I guess the one thing I'll say is, this movie is non-canon. That's the way that I've always viewed it mentally. It all takes place in the mind of a child. Godzilla never really attacks in the real world, so I always skip this on my rewatches. Straight up, that's what I do. And that's what I recommend for people trying to get into the franchise because, oh boy.
Do you ever fight?
Guy, no! I'm chicken.
The pacing in this movie is brutal. Just miserable. It somehow manages to be both painfully slow and weirdly repetitive, which is an impressive feat in the worst way possible. The biggest offender has to be the scene where Ichiro gets pulled up the rope. It feels like it lasts forever, full on, am I trapped watching some kind of edit that someone made where the scene just loops forever? It just drags on and on, long past the point of even being remotely necessary. It's like they had to pad out the runtime, or the movie's actively trying to test your patience. And then the most egregious aspect of this movie is the stock footage problem. The sheer amount of recycled monster fights is already bad enough, but the way they're paced makes it even worse. At first, you're kind of like, alright, I've seen this one before, and then the next fight happens and you realize, oh, I already watched that one in the prior movie, and then it just kind of loops and you start going, oh, this is just a clip show. It's the same battle over and over and over and over again. Once Ichiro finally makes it to Monster Island, things do get to be a little bit more interesting. Granted, we're mostly just watching clips from Son of Godzilla and Ebra Horror of the Deep, but at least it's kind of entertaining. It's like watching YouTube clips of Godzilla fight scenes, but with a loose narrative kind of tying everything together. And when I say that they are ripped entirely, this is just an entire scene just being shown to the audience with the occasional reaction shot of Ichiro and Minya. That's the movie. It's cheap and I don't like it. I think this is really, really egregious. It's so blatant and the movie is so short that I think if you cut out the stock footage, it would maybe be like a 30-minute long movie, honestly. If you go into this with the mindset that it is just a glorified clip show for kids, then sure, it's fine. And to be fair, the way they do integrate some of the footage can be a little creative. One thing I do genuinely like is the choice to have a child protagonist. It makes sense for a movie aimed at younger audiences, and it kind of lays the groundwork for kids to become Godzilla fans in the first place. When Ichiro is running around Monster Island, it has this kind of endearing, I'm a kid playing in my backyard pretending I'm on an adventure type of feel. It taps into that childhood sense of imagination in a way that's actually really charming. Ichiro and Minya talking is just insane.
Your folks will get kind of worried, won't they?
I don't think so. They're hardly home any time at all.
Every time it happens, I feel like I'm on hard drugs. There's something so deeply unnatural about seeing Minya not only communicate with a human, but to do so in this oddly casual, almost like sitcom way. We'll get to the voice eventually. Don't worry. Gabra is one of the few redeeming elements of the movie. I love his design, especially the fact that he's meant to be an ogre. I think that's really unique. I like that he doesn't have a tail, which differentiates him from other reptilian monsters in the series. I completely forgot also that the human bully in this movie also shares the name Gabra, which is a nice little thematic detail. His roar is also fantastic. It almost sounds like he's mocking Minya's roar.
Gabra!
Gabra?
And I love his electricity powers as well. Surprisingly, the original fight scenes where Godzilla and Minya take on Gabra are really fun. The action is super cartoony, and in a way, it feels like a precursor to the goofier parts of films like Godzilla vs. Megalon. Also, I have to mention that the 1968 Godzilla suit looks phenomenal here. Easily my favorite Godzilla suit of all time, hands down. But that is very jarring because that's not the only suit used in this film. Because they rely on stock footage, we get the 67 suit and the 66 suit almost interchangeably in between shots, and that becomes very jarring very quickly. The Godzilla vs. Kamanga fight is really interesting because they had to work around the fact that in Son of Godzilla, Minya was incapacitated during the scene and was in a lot of the shots. But in Godzilla's Revenge, he's seen up on a hill with Ichiro. So the way they edit around it is really clever, and at one point, they literally just plopped a rock on top of where Minya was originally incapacitated. I honestly just have to admire that. There's so much creativity there in not having the budget to just reshoot the scene, and I think that's kind of genius, even if it is just another sequence lifted almost entirely from a previous movie. The bank robbery subplot where Ichiro gets kidnapped by actual criminals is insane. Up until that point, the movie is mostly goofy, harmless fun, and then suddenly we're dealing with literal child abduction. It's not a, oh my god, a monster's destroying the city type of dark. It's real world dark, and it feels weirdly out of place. The whole thing just comes off as excessive, especially considering that the movie's core message is about standing up to bullies. Obviously, they don't go into funny games territory where they're torturing Ichiro or anything, but was it really necessary to escalate things all the way to child kidnapping? And then there's the part where at the end of the movie, Ichiro just beats the shit out of the human version of Gabra. I know that some people think it's too much, that it sends the wrong message to kids that, you shouldn't beat up your bully, just tell a trusted adult and talk with them and, sit down with the bully. That doesn't work. Speaking from personal experience, sometimes the only way to get a bully to stop is to just throw hands. It's a blunt, old-fashioned approach, but this movie was from the late 60s, so what else could you really expect? It's not the most nuanced take on standing up for yourself, but it's direct, and in the context of the movie, I think it works really well. Controversial maybe, but I respect the commitment. That being said, none of this changes the fact that Godzilla's Revenge is just not a good movie. You could say it's so bad it's good, but it's still bad. There's a reason that it's so widely hated by Godzilla fans. It's ungodly cheap, incredibly lazy, and while there are a few weird little highlights sprinkled throughout, you really have to dig in to find them. The film was released in America as Godzilla's Revenge, with it being part of a double feature with a Christopher Lee sci-fi flick titled Island of the Burning Damned. Kind of funny seeing these two side by side on a promotional poster. But oddly enough, the film received several different titles here in the States, as it also went by Minya, Son of Godzilla, and Terror of Godzilla. The English dub was supervised by a man named Riley Jackson, who had previously worked on other international releases of Toho films like King Kong Escapes, Monster Zero, and The War of the Gargantuas. Now, you may be wondering, why am I bringing up some random dub supervisor? Which is a valid question to ask, since this is the first time in any of these retrospectives that I've ever mentioned this role. Well, I bring this up because Riley Jackson is the voice of Minya.
Godzilla says that I should learn to fight my own battles,
Against big guys?
Uh-huh.
To me, Jackson's extremely goofy performance as Godzilla's son has always been my absolute favorite part of this film. In the original Japanese version, Minya was voiced by a woman named Midori Uchiyama.
何してんの?友達がいなくてつまんないやん。じゃあ僕と同じだ。
And while she does a fine job, I just love how Jackson's voice sounds. It's honestly nothing short of iconic for American Godzilla fans like myself that grew up with this specific dub of the film. One specific change from the Japanese dub to the English dub that I absolutely hate is the removal of the song Monster March by Lily Sasaki and the Tokyo Children's Choir. Don't get me wrong, the track is borderline unlistenable and god-awful, but it just adds to the experience of watching Godzilla's Revenge. The children's vocals are so terrible, and I love it.
Go! Go! Yeah! Kaijus!
To wrap it all up, Godzilla's Revenge is one of the few Godzilla movies that I think deserves a remake. Usually, I find the idea of remaking classic Godzilla movies beat for beat to be rather sacrilegious, but there's a ton of potential for a kid-friendly Godzilla adventure. I think it would absolutely work in an animated format, maybe like the recent animated film Ultraman Rising. I'm not someone that has a problem with Godzilla being geared towards kids. I know a decent chunk of the fan base doesn't like that, but speaking from experience, as a former child, a large amount of Godzilla fans are children. I know this because I make videos about Godzilla. Go to the comments on any of my YouTube shorts, and you'll see literal fetuses arguing with each other. What I'm getting at is, films like Godzilla's Revenge are important. You might disagree with me, but movies like this are a gateway for younger viewers to get into the fandom. And if you don't believe me, just think about how most people even got into this franchise. It wasn't from watching Shin Godzilla and contemplating the horrors of bureaucracy at the young age of 5. It was because at some point when they were a kid, they saw a big monster stomping around and thought, that guy's cool as hell. Godzilla's been a hero, a villain, and even a dad trying to teach his son how to fight. There's room for variety, and that's what makes Godzilla so great. And let's be honest, it's not like Godzilla's Revenge is sacred ground. We're talking about a movie that was made out of spare parts and somehow managed to work despite that. It's a harmless kids movie with a good message about how, if you're being bullied, you should just beat the shit out of them in order to gain respect from all your peers. If anything, a remake would be an opportunity to take the core idea, a kid using Godzilla as an escape, and actually do something new with it. Embrace animation as an actual artistic medium. Lean into the surreal dream logic. Think Never-Ending Story meets Studio Ghibli, with Godzilla thrown into the mix. Obviously, I don't expect this to actually happen, but if it did, I would not be mad about it by any metric. Because if we don't let kids have their own Godzilla movies, then in 20 years, it's just going to be the same people arguing about power scaling or whether the legendary Godzilla is too fat. And frankly, that's a fate worse than Godzilla's Revenge. And with all of that out of the way, I'm Cole McCormick. You're watching Firewood Media. This is just one part of my massive Godzilla retrospective. I think this is part 10, I think. Should be. I don't know. I'm covering every single Godzilla movie and TV show. I've already covered the MonsterVerse as well as all prior Showa era installments, so go and check those out. Right now, if you're watching this when the video came out, it means that I am recovering from wisdom tooth removal surgery, so yeah. It'll be a little bit till I post consistently again. There will be a video out next Friday, so stay tuned for that. I kind of scheduled everything out so that I just have like one upload a week and I can just focus on recovering. Given that my job is me talking, I kind of figured, maybe it's best if I just don't talk for a little while and rest all this. Anyways, I just wanted to say thank you so much for watching. Feel free to check out more videos on the channel just like this. We got some bigger ones in the works that are longer retrospectives. After I'm done with the Godzilla retrospective series, I know I want to get into Gamera and Ultraman and do giant retrospectives on them. Of course, I've seen those like a million times, but part of me is just like, I want to really deep dive into them and go completely in depth like I do with these. I've seen some requests for that, so I just want to kind of put that on the record now that yes, that will happen, but just not until the Godzilla retrospectives are done. Beyond that, thank you again for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Peace out.